Good evening. And tonight we're so excited to continue our LOC Connection series. And we have a special treat tonight with Mary Lou. But first, we're going to go around the gallery and introduce ourselves. So just say your name and the company that you represent in the class. Shannon,
So I'm Shannon Hawkins and I represent C1.
Diane,
Diane Wheeler, and I represent A4.
Erica,
Erica, and I represent H1.
Jenny,
Hi, Jenny Lennox, C1 and First Reg.
thank you, and Susan,
Hi, I'm Susan Wilhite, and I represent A2.
Sonia,
Sonia Critton and A3.
and Marianne,
Mary Durso, C4.
and Teresa,
Teresa Hogarth, G3.
and Lynn,
Lynn Belcher, C1.
Carol,
Carol Van Dree, F4.
and I'm Pam Warwick, and my husband's from I3. Mary Lou is Dr. Mary Lou, and she has a EDD in education leadership. And she's an acclaimed writer. She's very artistic. She has videos out there playing the flute. She's the subject matter expert on obituary writing in our class, Quality of Life. She's the fourth Reg leader. She's a daughter, mother, grandmother, and a wife, and we all call her friend. And she is our presenter tonight, and I'm very excited about the very emotional and honoring things that she has to share. So, Mary Lou, please.
Well, thank you, Pam. I appreciate that. I am going to share my screen. There we go. So, writing an obituary for a loved one, it is not necessarily the easiest thing to do, whether you do it in advance or whether you do it at the time. I guess you could say, had the misfortune, or I've had the honor, let me put it that way. I have had the honor of writing obituaries for a sister, a brother, both of my parents, and my nephew. So it is not an easy thing, and I think that a lot of times, I knew as my parents were aging that I was the one that was going to be writing the obituary, and I thought I would get some things ahead of time, and I was able to get some things, but it's still, most of it got shoved off to the end, and it becomes a very emotional thing as you're writing the obituary, because you want to say the right thing. Your whole objective is to honor that person that you love. And so I would ask you to remember that as you're writing the obituary, you're writing about the life of that person. You are not writing about the death, but about their life, and you're trying to capture that. So in obituary writing, there used to be a lot of rules. There was a template that you went through, and once you were done with that template, you were basically done with the obituary. And that is just not the case anymore. And the reason why it has become not the case is that there used to be an obituary writer at the newspaper, and there were obituary writers that worked for each one of the funeral homes, and they wrote the obituaries. Well, now you're writing the obituary, or someone is writing that obituary, and then you are paying to have that put into the newspaper. And so a lot of the rules for obituary writing have gone out the window. The one thing that has really gone out the window is the cause of death. The cause of death no longer has to be listed in an obituary, but it did until you started paying for the obituary. And now it does not need to be listed in the obituary. But I will tell you that when people read obituaries, what they're looking for, they want to hear about the life, but they're also wondering, what did this person die? Why, how did this person die? And so they're going through the obituary and they're looking or little clues that will tell them how this person died. And so a lot of obituarists will say, just go ahead and list the cause of death, and that way you can get on with the obituary and tell about the life of that person. But that's a personal choice. You handle it the way you want to. So the normal sequence of events for an obituary is that there'll be a death notice that is put in the newspaper. And then that just basically explains that the person has died. It might tell you where and when the service is going to be held, but it's very, very short, to the point, and really doesn't tell anything about the person. It doesn't give you a picture of who that person was at all. The next thing that will show up generally is the newspaper obituary. But as newspaper obituaries are becoming more and more and more expensive, people are opting to go with either a shorter newspaper obituary, or they're opting to opt out of a newspaper obituary and they will go with an online obituary. And if they do that, a lot of times in the death notice, it will give you a reference to the funeral home, and you can then link that reference and go to the funeral home and see the full obituary. I had a friend whose husband passed away about 4 or 5 months ago, and there was a death notice printed, and then eventually there was an obituary that it was a self-penned obituary that he had written. And I thought, well, that's very nice. And then about 2 months later, I received a link to the online obituary, and the online obituary was wonderful. It had his self-penned obituary, and then each one of the children and grandchildren and his wife and one of the friends wrote a little addendum about the person, and it was lovely. I'd never seen anything like that, and I really enjoyed it. As I said, there are no rules about how to write an obituary. So you're writing it. Do you include things that you feel uncomfortable about, such as the former spouse? You don't need to if you don't want to. Of course, if there were children that were born, then you're probably going to want to list the former spouse. Otherwise, these children just mysteriously appeared. So I am always careful not to list the names of minor children. I don't do that. I don't think it's the right thing to do. It makes them targets. And they're saying now that you should only list the year and the month of birth. You should not list the entire birth date, because there are people out there who are stealing identities of people who have passed away. So the first step in writing any obituary is getting the facts. You need to get the facts before you can begin to fill out the obituary. And so what I use is the fill-in-the-blank obituary template, and we are going to make sure that you get a copy of that template, and hopefully we will have a link to it also when this is posted. But the fill-in-the-blank template is a Word document, and so you save it to your computer and then just begin filling that out. And if you can do that while they're alive, that's a wonderful thing. Now, over on the left, there is a warning, and it says identity theft has now deteriorated to the point where one's identity is being stolen even after death. This notice came from our Quality of Life manual. This is straight out of the Quality of Life manual. And it also says that you want to have a friend or house sitter watch your home during funerals, because burglars often scan local obituary columns and then burglarize the home during the funeral. And so that is good information to have. So if possible, you want to get the facts ahead of time. If you have a loved one who is still living and still with you, then you want to get that obituary template out, sit down with them, fill it out, and then I think you should flip it over And on the back side, you should ask them these 3 questions. How do you want to be remembered? What are you most proud of? And what would you like your tombstone to say? And that's a different way of saying how do you want to be remembered, but it can encapsulate just exactly what it is that they want said about them. And the last thing that I would say is that you want to, if at all possible, to honor your loved ones while they are still alive. So, for example, my mother and father, on their 65th wedding anniversary, we had a great family get together, and all of the kids and grandchildren, everybody brought a story, and they read the story out loud to my mother and father, and that was just one of the happiest moments that my mom and dad had. And I would encourage you to find some way of celebrating your loved ones while they are still alive. You do not need to wait until they are past to do this. As you're starting to then fill out the obituary itself and make the obituary about them, you want to figure out what was it that made this person unique? What was unique about them? And so here I've got, when one of her cats died, word would go out in cat circles and a new stray would appear at the back door to take up residence. Well, that's a nice way of saying she was a cat lady, isn't it? But it says a little bit more than that. If cats felt comfortable, if strays felt comfortable coming to her home, can't you see her also collecting people that way? That people loved being around her and would go to her home. So to me, that tells a lot about the person. We will miss his curiosity and zest for life, his startling belly laugh, his great sense of humor, and his kindness to all. And what I hear in that statement is that startling belly laugh. I mean, it captures just a unique characteristic of this individual, and it makes him very, very human and very, very approachable. So then this last one came out of an obituary that I use a great deal. He had lived a long and passionate life dedicated to rambunctious performances and dairy products. And so that one, you're curious. That piques my curiosity. Rambunctious performances. What kind of rambunctious performances did he have? And this love of dairy products. That's very interesting. And so that really piques my interest and want to find out more about this particular individual. So as you're talking about your loved one, you want to tell stories. You want to use stories to tell about them. You don't want to say he grew up on a farm. So this is a different way of saying this. He was prodigious with the movement of manure from an early age, and exercising these and other talents, he earned recognition for his national 4-H champion dairy heifer at the age of 10. So what do I hear there? Well, I hear that he worked hard. He knew how to work hard. And he was a showman. He was a showman. And I hear that in that story also. So instead of saying he was a hard worker, say something like, after retirement in 1994, he was back in the office the next day. His devotion to geology kept him coming back for the next 9 years. And so that's a story. And that tells us so much more than just saying he was a hard worker. Because a lot of us are hard workers, but this tells us what type of a hard worker he was. And he was dedicated. He was passionate about what he did. And he thought that what he did was important. So that's what those stories tell me. You want to use humor in your obituary if at all possible, so don't be afraid to use humor. Here's one. Despite consuming more than 2,000 pounds of butter, he never suffered from any kind of heart disease, and his last meal was ice cream. So there we've got a little bit of humor, just something to make us smile as we read that obituary. We should smile as we read the obituary. We should be able to learn something about the individual, but we should also be able to smile about that individual's life. Once during a particularly challenging golf round, his ball landed in a pond. He waded in without a second thought, ruining his shoes but saving his shot, all the while cracking jokes that had everyone in stitches. So here you have somebody who was not afraid to be the butt of a joke and was not afraid to be the comic and certainly wanted to save that shot, didn't he? So the last thing that I would tell you to do is to enlist help. This is something that is hard to do alone in a room by yourself. So if your loved one is still alive, I would ask them to help you, to get input from them and what do they want it to say. Maybe write the obituary and then have them look at it and say, well, I like this, I don't like this, I'd like to have it say something different. Can we come at it from a different approach? If they're gone, get input from family and friends. Do a Zoom call. Get everybody on the Zoom call and just talk about them. And you'll hear the stories and you'll hear the themes coming through that should be in that obituary. When my nephew was terminally ill, he asked me to help his son write his obituary. And I asked him, first of all, what do you want in your obituary? And he gave me a list of things that he would like to have. But then we had a family Zoom. We got everybody together on the Zoom call, and my nephew was able to join the Zoom call for a while. And so as they were telling his stories, he was able to hear those stories, and certain themes came through. And so I sat down and finished up the obituary using what they had done. And then I sent it off to he and his son, and they made a few changes to it, but it was basically the same thing that I had put together for them. So get help so that you're not doing it by yourself. And another thing to do is have people proofread it and make suggestions. And sometimes it's very difficult for somebody to make a suggestion on how to, to change an obituary, because they're afraid that, this is something that you have done in honor of somebody, and they don't want to say anything. And so I would ask them very particular questions. I would say, what do you particularly like about this? If you could change one thing in this obituary, what would it be? Is there a story that I should have told that tells something more about this person? I would ask questions, because sometimes just to give it to somebody and say, come back to me with your opinion is not enough. You have to ask particular questions and solicit that input. But the more people that have eyes on this, I think the better product you are going to have as an obituary. So my last slide basically goes back over those steps. You want to be able to get the facts. And the obituary template basically leads you through that step by step, and you can keep what you want and get rid of things that you don't want in that obituary template. How do they want to be remembered? If they're not alive and they can't tell you how they want to be remembered, how do you want to remember them? How does the rest of your family want to remember them? And then that should come through in that obituary. What it is that made them unique. can we somehow fit that in so that when people read this obituary, they actually can almost not picture the person because they don't know, well, they've got the picture there in their obituary, but they have an interest now. Oh, I wish I had known that person while they were alive. What an, something that makes them live for just a moment longer as other people are reading this obituary. Be sure to use stories to talk about them. And don't be afraid to use humor. And finally, be sure to get the entire family involved and enlist help in writing an obituary. And hopefully, by following these steps, you'll be able to come up with a product, an obituary that honors that person that you love. I'm open for questions.
Well, I have a comment. My dad passed away 13 months ago, and I had taken Mary Lou's class a year or so before. And in the delegation of duties after my dad passed away, my husband Bob got the obituary that he was asked to write, and he was generously given an hour. And I kept saying, Mary Lou says stories. Mary Lou says stories. And Bob wrote a nice obituary, and then we were all proofing it. And my sister said her favorite story from her deceased son, who had died his first month in college, and she wanted it included. And that turned out to be Mary Lou's favorite story in my dad's obituary. And it's just, we used everything Mary Lou had said in the class to pull this thing together quickly. And we're so grateful for Mary Lou and her advice.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I thought, Mary Lou, that was excellent. I had to write the obituary for my mother, and I wasn't given much time at all. It was, at the funeral home, and I didn't get any help from anyone at the funeral home. And after I wrote it, I found out I had left out a lot of relatives who ended up showing up and I can't understand why. I wouldn't have thought they were cousins. I knew them. But it's just, you're right, unless you do it ahead of time, you are just, even though her death was anticipated, you're just never really prepared off the cuff. So your advice is just excellent. I guess the big thing now is getting people to follow it and go to the time, because that would be very hard. I know after I watched your class on obituaries, I mentioned it to Joe, and he said, "Oh, so and so's going to write it." It was one of his classmates. Well, I'm not so sure, but it may be difficult to get our spouses, or maybe my spouse, to even want to go through this. I'm going to work on him.
I think that the obituary template is the thing to start. If you've got that, you can work on it later. You can work on it later, but the facts are so important to have.
And this is Sonia. I went through this somewhat recently after I took Mary Lou's class, and it was just very timely. My best friend's husband passed. Shouldn't have been unexpectedly, but it was. And just having that template was so good. And then that was passed to her kids and everybody else. And everybody else started using that very, very quickly and came together. But just having the template itself was so important. And there were people, like you mentioned, that would have been left out. And there were misspellings of names and all sorts of things. But having that template to at least set out as a starting point is really, really important. So I appreciate you coming up with this. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. When it happens, it's always so stressful and griefful. And so thank you very much. It's really helpful. It's wonderful. Thank you.
This is Lynn. I lost my sister in December, and she was divorced and she has just one child. And, we talk about writing obituaries for our spouses, but also thinking about our children having to write our obituaries. And, she had not a clue, obviously she knew her mom, but all of the things that her mom had done, when she was little and wasn't paying attention or before she was born. And it just so happened that we were sitting there that night struggling, trying to figure out what to write and what some of the information was. She happened to scroll through her mom's phone, and her mom had actually written her obituary, and it was on her phone. So it's not just important for us to write our spouses. So I have had Gerald sit down because we've been married 48 or 47 years, but we didn't have our children until we were married 19 years. So our kids know nothing about either the first 19 years of our marriage. So I've had him sit down and write his, and giving them all the back information, before they were even born, that they don't even realize. His whole military career, they know nothing about. So thank you.
You're welcome. I think, if you're going to sit down and you're going to write somebody's obituary that is still alive, but maybe, they're getting up there in age, if it's a parent and they're getting up there in age, and yes, you should be anticipating this, but you don't really want to think about it. I think a glass of wine is a wonderful way to handle that. Mm.
Um,
Teresa?
Mary Lou, I just wanted to say um, my husband had lost him unexpectedly with COVID. And I was the second marriage and it got complicated. When it came time for the obituary, it was the hardest thing. I mean, I'm still torn up by it. It took 2 days of just painful wishing that he had told me how to write this obituary, because I was wanting to honor him, but I didn't know what he wanted said. And I'm so glad that you actually have a template and have a guideline to go by, because when you don't have anything and you're still in shock, it's just really difficult. So I think this is a wonderful thing that you're doing.
One of the, I'm sorry that you had to go through that. That is a very, very, very tough thing, especially in those circumstances. One of the most interesting obituaries I've read was in the Ames Tribune, and that's a local newspaper here in Iowa. And it was an obituary for somebody who had died like 15 years earlier. And she tells the story very similarly to yours, that she was blindsided and didn't know what to put in it, and every time she would look at that obituary, it was upsetting to her to see it, because it wasn't really what she wanted to say. And so after 15 years, she published another obituary for her husband. So
Wow.
Therapeutic.
Yes.
Mary Lou, I think one of the most important things you said tonight is that, and I had not thought of, and I've oldest child, have had to write everything. My grandparents, my mom, my dad, help with my aunts, is I never thought about what were they proud of, how did they wanted. I always push through, and it's like wanting to say the right thing, but it was me wanting to say the right thing. And I think that's one of the most important things that you've changed in my thinking about this because I really wanted to honor them and and I was left alone in a room, with a short time as well. But I did have just kind of some, uh, I wonder about, is there something that's too long? Is there something that's too short? Can you
There's
tell too much?
there's nothing that's too long for an online obituary. Although, if it's going to take somebody 20 minutes to read it, they're going to lose interest.
Okay.
How long if they can read it in 5 minutes, maybe 6 minutes, that will hold their attention. If not, they're not going to read the entire obituary.
I have one more thing. After the service that my mother and my siblings had for my dad, one of my dad's dear friends at the center where mom and dad lived came up to me and he said, you really missed who your dad was, his sense of humor. And people kept saying that. And my mother and I were talking separately a few days afterwards. And my mother said, we didn't see that side of him, did we? And she and I nodded, but because my dad had a public persona, and then he was who he was in the family, and I didn't feel bad about missing the sense of humor. I was delighted to learn that he had shared that with all the people where he had been. So that was huge for me.
Any other questions? Well, I personally would like to thank you all for joining today. This is not necessarily the easiest topic to talk about, but I can tell from your comments that it certainly is a topic that has already touched all of us. It's a topic that we've all had to deal with, and maybe this presentation will help you better prepare for the next time you have to deal with it.
Thank you, Mary Lou. Appreciate this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.